So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on data, AI, and the environment. I'm delighted to welcome all our speakers here. We will be holding a conversation around the governing of smart forests, afforestation apps, and its relation to corporate land use, and also looking at intersectional praxis from a planetary perspective. So it's quite a breadth and a span of work that we're going to be considering here today, and I welcome you all. So without further ado, I would like to pass on to our first speaker, Alison Powell, who will be doing, some housekeeping to start off the session, and then we will roll into the speakers. Thank you, Alison.
Yes, thanks, Teresa. I also just want to remind everyone, if you have not been on a webinar recently, the chat and the Q&A are at the bottom. I would encourage you to put questions for the panelists in the Q&A box so that we can have them addressed. We have closed captioning on this session, and if you want to follow using closed captions, you can either follow using the closed caption link, live transcription link, or you can also use the stream text link. And this link will be posted in the chat. If you haven't met me before, I'm Alison Powell. I'm the director of the Just AI program. There's an entire set of events all of this week. If you're interested in other ones, please have a look on the Ada Lovelace Institute website for the rest of the program. And I'm going to pass to Teresa. I will be monitoring the chat and supporting Teresa in this wonderful panel, which I'm so happy to be participating in.
Thanks, Alison. So I'm going to pass over to our first speaker, Professor Jennifer Gabrys. Each speaker will give a short introduction to their own work, followed then by a presentation. We have two presentations today from Jennifer and Jaya Chakrabarti, who will be speaking about her work on the afforestation app Vana. We will then have a response from Squirrel Nation and follow then with some open questions. Jennifer, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Teresa, for the introduction, and Alison as well. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Jaya and Squirrel Nation. I'm just going to share my screen here. So today I'm going to give an overview of the Smart Forest project, drawing out some of the key points that I think can speak to this overarching theme of data, AI, ethics, and the environment. It's great to see attention to environment in a space that is often looking at other kinds of data. But what Smart Forest tries to do is really think about the implications of these technologies within spaces of environmental management and governance. So this is an ERC funded project. It's based in the Department of Sociology at Cambridge, and we are a team composed of 6 people, and we are undertaking a scan of forests around the world that are now increasingly digitalized. But of course, this comes within the broader context of the significance of forests at this moment of planetary environmental change and of the loss of forests. Of course, there's no shortage of material documenting the effects of wildfire, deforestation, commodity extraction, and more, and how this affects forest environments around the world in different ways. So technologies are really stepping into this space as a way to monitor deforestation, as a way to potentially oversee supply chains, to encourage different kinds of participation where people can report on events, where they can undertake their own sorts of mapping. And all of these different digital technologies are in various ways creating forms of governance in relation to forests that are really digitally guided. So this is where the Smart Forest Project steps in to really think about how these digital technologies are attempting to govern environmental change, but also how they might potentially worsen environmental crises through their resource impacts, through the particular forms of inequality that they could introduce. So here's where, by looking at digital governance, this also raises questions about equity, plurality, and livability. So I'll say more about what I mean by that in a moment. But the key research question that we're really attending to is, how do smart forests shape environmental governance, civic engagement, and socio-political strategies for addressing environmental change? Of course, it can be easy enough to think that digital technologies will be a quick way to try to short circuit this problem, but they will bring along with them their own sorts of socio-political configurations that really need to be studied so as to ensure equity and to ensure that people are not displaced from forest environments, among other issues. So this is where our key areas of emphasis are really to look at how digital technologies could, of course, enable, but also constrain democratic approaches to environmental change. So there could very well be forms of participatory mapping that bring in Indigenous voices for documenting their territories and to ensure that they are not displaced, for instance, by extractive industries. But there could also be technologies that do displace people by virtue of trying to save forest spaces. So this is something that we want to look at. Of course, there's been no shortage of research also on smart environments, for instance, smart cities being one of the key environments that has been studied, as well as smart oceans and other environments. But here we want to look especially at smart forests as an area that has been understudied. And here we're thinking about how technologies are then remaking forests and how forests also become technologies of sorts. So I'll walk through the 5 digital operations that our study is organized into. These digital operations raise many points that I think are points of consideration in relation to the theme of this discussion today, which is to really think about how these socio-political effects can be anticipated, addressed, hopefully circumvented, and how it might be possible to do computing otherwise, to decolonize computing so that it doesn't enforce different types of hierarchical and extractive relations to forests and forest dwellers. So the first area that we are looking at is observation technologies. And here, this is probably one of the most long-standing areas of digital operations in forests. Of course, remote sensing being perhaps the longest and widest example of this sort of practice. But this is, of course, amplifying and becoming even more advanced now, where not only is there on-the-ground sensing, remote sensing, supply chain monitoring, but there are also maps with real-time data that are being constantly updated through various remote sensing to ensure that there can be oversight of different forest environments. But this also means that different forest environments become more legible and potentially more available for extraction. So forests are, of course, in need of monitoring as a way to determine their extent and breadth, but also this is a way of managing forests in particular modalities. So this is to say that people might measure carbon in a forest, but might overlook different sorts of entities and relationships. So it's always a matter of asking, what are these observation technologies doing? What does this data document? And I'll say more about this in a moment. So really, observation technologies capture forests in specific ways. In some cases, this might be as resources rather than cosmologies. So how is it possible to think about smart forests, to think about these digital technologies as something that do not only operate in one register, that might become more than just a limited view onto forests, and so that there is not this one dominant way of engaging with digital technologies in forests. And in some cases, digital technologies might not be the most appropriate intervention or way of engaging in a space. So it's important to ask that question as well. So as I mentioned, these technologies can also facilitate extraction. It's very well established that many observation techniques that are mapping and establishing where forest resources are then also facilitate different modes of commodity extraction and deforestation. So these kinds of contradictions tend to be bundled into the capacities of these digital operations. So part of this is asking, how can this link potentially be broken? Is this also about bringing in some of these more pluralistic approaches to what observation is and what it is doing? So the second digital operation that we look at is automation and optimization. And of course, these digital operations are linked, but this particular area is looking at how forest processes become automated, how they become optimized. This is something that happens in all sorts of sensor networks, in IoT and drone configurations, where everything from soil and moisture levels to forest fires can be monitored and in some cases intervened within in smart networks that attempt to modulate and regulate forest environments. Of course, this also is an area that is being explored in relation to carbon stock, how to manage and preserve carbon stock, the extent to which then forests are optimized as carbon holding entities. Of course, then this raises the question of what other things might be excluded from forest environments if they're viewed primarily as carbon stock. So if forests are optimized as carbon environments rather than other kinds of environments. And this is where I think automation and optimization practices really raise the question of how these converge or diverge from diverse and situated forest practices and values. Of course, it's important to establish where these carbon sinks are located, but these ways of managing forests might not necessarily align with existing forest dwellers. So these are the kinds of investigations that are really in need of being developed further, because many of these technologies are being developed at a level of planetary governance to address climate change, but are not always enrolling forest dwellers into these projects. Of course, there's a vast array of examples here that I'm glossing over in this short talk, but these technologies really can amplify some of the problems that have been identified so far. And these are, of course, not depoliticized decisions, and they have consequences for specific forest livelihoods. So the third area that we look at with these digital operations is datafication. And this is really looking at how data is being generated as a way to manage environments. Of course, one of the key things that climate scientists and environmental scientists often say is that to manage a problem, you need to measure it. But here, and again, drawing on sociology and science and technology studies, forests come to matter in distinct ways depending on what is measured and monitored. So here, how does data help to make particular environmental decisions, and how does it potentially overlook certain aspects of forest environments through measuring and monitoring in particular ways? So data practices can, of course, enable or impede action depending on what is measured or monitored. And forests are often sites of expert monitoring. But of course, many forest dwellers have diverse knowledge about these environments that may or may not be brought into these data practices. So I'm showing here some examples from a sensor network where I did field work some time ago, but there were a number of webcams installed to look at when these bluebirds were laying their eggs and hatching out, and this became a way within a sensor network to determine what the phenology of the site was. So were the eggs hatching out earlier, and how was this potentially an indicator of climate change? So if forests are only relevant if they're rendered into other data sets, then how does this potentially overlook other forest cosmologies that might also contribute relevant insights? Of course, this is one way to look at a forest entity, a forest dweller, but there might be other relationships with organisms that should also be brought into account when monitoring these spaces. So, of course, the datafication of forests raises the question of whose data counts. Here you can see a temporal rendering of this bird cam and how it shows us something particular about this environment, but it doesn't tell the whole picture. So how can different practices of datafication attend to these different ways of making forests matter through data? Then the forced digital operation that we look at is participation. Of course, this is an area where there really is a proliferating number of technologies and apps and platforms and ways of engaging with forests, often when they are quite remote from where many people are living who are digitally active. So how are these digital technologies changing forest engagements and participation? One of the things that we look at is how participatory technologies make the forest sensible and actionable. Here you can see an example of the Munduruku tribe using drones in the Amazon that are provided by the UN to help monitor their territory. And this is a quite common practice where indigenous people, different tribes use drones to countermap, is a term that's used in the literature, their territories and try to ensure then that that territory will be preserved from further deforestation or extraction to varying effects. But here, participatory technologies are not only something used by people remote from forest environments, but can also be ways of networking across forest environments when connecting up people who live here and then also people who might be in sites of governance and policymaking. And of course, digital technologies enable distinct civic contributions here with urban smart forests, and they potentially also foreclose other forms of civic action. So it's important to ask with these participatory technologies, what forms of world making do they generate? This, of course, relates to some of the earlier questions about how these technologies make certain worlds matter. This is also a question about who then is involved in these world-making activities and to what sorts of effects, what kinds of collective and social arrangements, what political effects do these technologies have, and how can we be sure that these questions are really being investigated. This is what Smart Forests is undertaking right now, so that digital technology is not just thrown into the bucket of further kind of solutionism through technology. So the final digital operation that we look at is regulation and transformation. And this is really looking at how regulatory objectives are put into practice with the aid of digital technologies, as well as how forest environments are transformed through digital technologies, also how they become digital technologies of sorts. You can see many examples of projects now proliferating in this space as well, where people are attempting to create systems of, that have become green infrastructures, environmental infrastructures that are integrated with digital technologies so that plants become sensors, green infrastructure becomes wired, regulated, monitored, and then also transforming here, I think, both technology and forest environments, whether they're urban or otherwise, so that they're made to operate according to certain regulatory logics. So of course, this raises the question of how to think about these infrastructures, how to ensure, again, that they're democratic and equitable, that they're not technocratic figurations that end up having dire socio-political effects. Here you can see a diagram of Drone Seed Restoration, which is a company that uses drones to try to amplify the amount of tree replanting. Of course, the question to always ask with tree replanting initiatives is to ensure that these are biodiverse, that they involve communities, that they're sustained over time, and a whole host of other considerations that are often overlooked in a kind of quantitative push to reach certain numbers of millions and billions of trees in a reforestation campaign. So in this mutual transformation of forests and technologies, of course, the question is also, what are the limits of these interactions? Do other kinds of actors and relations need to be brought into these discussions so that it's not a kind of technocratic imaginary? So this is really where we are located in the current stage of our research. We're in the stage of undertaking a survey of existing literature and technologies and sites, looking at how these technologies are configured, who the main actors, stakeholders, and spokespeople are, and undertaking interviews, developing a Smart Forest Atlas, where we'll be documenting many of these technologies. Within this, we're asking, and again here I think to connect up with some of the questions of this discussion today, we're asking how to go beyond the scale of the planetary and think about the planetary in other ways, that this is not a kind of universal logic of how to govern one planet according to one logic, but instead as a way to think about planetary praxis, of how to undertake planetary engagements by attending to social political relations, inequities, different forest and environmental inhabitations and cosmologies when addressing environmental change, by being planetary as praxis. So I think we'll have a chance to say more about this in the Q&A, so I'll just leave that as an open provocation. There are many texts that you can refer to here if you're interested more in this topic. And you can also see more about our current research at smartforests.net. But I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the conversation that follows.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Jennifer. And now I would like to hand over to Jaya to speak towards Vana and the afforestation app that she has been developing with her colleagues.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Jaya Chakrabarti. I'm CEO of Semantrica Limited, and we started life creating a transparency platform, transparency in supply chains platform, because what we really wanted to do was influence corporate behavior. And for us, we've seen companies in the compliance space, and they act very much like sociopaths. So how do you influence a sociopath? That's the experiment we're running at the moment in various different places, but one of them is in corporate land ownership. I'm a physicist turned data scientist. I like to think of myself as a digital activist. And having spent the last 6 years wading through corporate compliance data, you will probably ask why, and I do periodically. I'm just going to share my screen, and then maybe I can give you a bit of an overview of what we've been doing. Let's see. Right, can you guys see that? I'll just do that, brilliant. So we call it an app. It's multiple things. What we've actually done is connected up multiple different data sources that are live and semi-live, and some of them are actually reasonably dormant. And we wanted to work out whether or not corporate land ownership was significant in the fight against climate change. whether or not we could activate that land and enable corporates to make decisions in the way that we would hope human beings do, that, you know, we've got something to throw into the fight, let's do something. So we started with data. So you've seen the news all over the place. Forest restoration isn't just one of our climate change solutions. It is overwhelmingly the top one. It's okay, so that's a sweeping generalization. We know it's not just that, and it's a whole heap of other things. We have to address biodiversity as a holistic system, a holistic solution. We have to be doing everything all at once. We can't just fix one end and forget the other. But it is the place that we started from, and I'm a self-confessed dendrophile. I'm someone who spent her childhood in apple trees, chucking apples at the kids next door, and talking to worms. So this was a good excuse to get back to those sorts of roots. That said, there are some stats that do try and put things into context. Private landowners apparently hold more than 900 million hectares of land globally. We're going to need probably twice that to recreate the lungs of the planet. But we needed to start our work on something solid. And because we were looking at corporate behaviors and what they have done to either damage or fix the planet, or just not help in many respects, we wanted to see what influenced those types of entities. If you think about it, the platform that we created first on transparency in supply chains it is effectively an internet of connected legal entities, or an internet of legal entities or companies. By corporates, we mean not just private companies, but entities like local government departments, governments and nations. We're talking about unlimited companies, all different types of entities that are not human. So bear that in mind. We're not just talking about private corporate entities. So the premise was really quite simple. We would identify land holdings. We've been using land registry data, and we pulled it into what we have called Companies House Mark II data. We have corrected as much as we can, so the landscape that we're working in is extremely dirty. I mean, in terms of data that's human entered and has many mistakes, and it's very difficult to map from one entity to another and know for 100% certainty that that is the same entity you're talking about. There are many different checks that we have to apply in order to say, actually, this is a confidence level. We think 85% sure this bit of land is owned by that corporate, because they change their names and the way that they register things. Well, once we've identified suitable land, and we've been very lucky, we have been working in partnership with Friends of the Earth, and they have done a brilliant project that has mapped out woodland opportunities across the country based on open data. There is better data available held within government, and we're hoping one day that we will get access to that. But in the meantime, we overlaid Friends of the Earth woodland opportunity data onto corporate land holdings, just to work out if there was a significant proportion owned by those corporates. And the answer is yes, they do. Based on the proportion that is owned, sorry, I should, and we've overlaid very many different data sets in order to do that in this SDF. So here we go. So maybe I'll do a bit of a breakdown of the data that's already there. There are 31,506 organisations that own enough suitable land to hit the tree planting targets. The targets we focused on were based on the 25-year environmental plan, which sets the target for 2042. You can see the breakdown of by region, because luckily Companies House does give you SIC codes, and they also give you postcodes, and we can overlay everything. So we know which are the most significant regions. Number one, as you can probably see, is actually in terms of percentage. We have the Northeast, although Southeast is pretty good too. And as you can see, corporate entities are different. You have councils, local authorities. Some define themselves as corporate bodies because they haven't managed to classify themselves in any other category. Some of them are hybrids, and it makes it difficult to work out where they actually sit on the private public kind of scale that we have. But with the SIC codes, you can see that unsurprisingly, the top sectors that own land start with agriculture, forestry and fishing, they move into real estate and then construction and so on and so forth. I think the critical thing here is that whilst you have lowest hanging fruit in terms of working by sector, we're talking about the whole of the long tail. So if we're going to do this, we're going to have to work with every single kind of entity and just work with the land that they've got. And some of them will be on the edges of their properties, some of them will be derelict land that can't have anything put on it. That there will be a whole mishmash of types of land that could be useful. Friends of the Earth data has gone for the most suitable, but that doesn't mean that's the end of it. And in fact, 130% of the suitable land is owned by corporate entities. I'll just keep going. So yeah, there you go. That's the stat that we managed to pull out. But I was told that it's quite difficult for people to understand what that 130% was. When I took it to the press, they were like, what does that mean? All it means is that we have 180,000 hectares of land required in order to hit the woodland target for England. And within England, 235,605 hectares of potential woodland exists within those corporate entities. And perhaps most encouragingly, that represents only 5% of the total land ownership on the corporate side of things. So that means it's not actually going to impact them greatly, although it might impact others depending on the proportion that they have. And then we did a deep dive because our funding came from UKRI and Southwest Creative Technology Network. Thank you very much. So we did a deep dive into the Southwest to see exactly what that proportion was. You can see that 26% of the land we need lies at in the toe of England. And you can break it down by all sorts of things. I won't go through all of that. But the other thing that we can do, because we have a transparency in supply chains platform, is overlay different kinds of regulations. So we can see types of companies based on the scope that they're within for say, Section 54 of the UK Modern Slavery Act, and say that although they only own 3.3% of woodland opportunity land, as defined by Friends of the Earth, that's 23.8% of the target for 2042. And now it's important because companies that are in scope for that particular regulation are large. They're 36 million plus. They are trading. They have that trading footprint in the UK, and quite often they are global entities in that they are part of big global groups. And we map all of that as part of what we do with TISC report. So you have to think about how corporates behave. I have said that they're sociopaths. It's because well, I'll stand by it because they seek to maximize shareholder value, they seek to maximize profits and minimize risk. That's what they do, and they do so in a regulatory environment, and the UK is quite rich in that respect in terms of regulations. And we can argue about whether or not there's enough enforcement, but that's a political discussion that is probably out of scope today. This is why we do need to look at all the different levers of influence on companies to see, you know, where they're supposed to care and not do damage. So the terrain that we work in, as I said, has much dirty data. There's a lot of human error. There's a lot of blindness about whether or not land is still owned by an entity because those records haven't necessarily been updated. There's double counting too. So if you look at a land record may also have mineral rights, which will be the same bit of land but underneath. Or you can have a building that has multiple floors and different titles. So we've had to do a lot of stripping out of duplications. And the other side of it is granularity of the overlay. So there is a much coveted data set that we want, which is the soils data and the low risk data from DEFRA on land that is most suitable for planting trees and doing other nature restoration work. But that data is out of our reach at the moment. It is proprietary and it is owned. And again, we can talk about open data and closed data and what impact that has on the mission in itself. But with the Friends of the Earth data, we have a good place to start because it's based on what is open. And you'll see also in terms of trying to map entities, it's such a, it's so boring, I know, that we spend a lot of our time trying to make sure that the entity we're talking about is the same one in other data sets, Companies House, open corporates, land registry data, that there are, those are just the basics. And then you have to trawl their websites, you have different trading names, you have different websites that may or may not belong to those entities. But there's a whole web of organizational data that we have to deal with in order to get to the basics. So as you can see, we are at the other end of the puzzle from Jennifer, because we are trying to work from the corporate jungle of data all the way out to those forests. And we're trying to connect the dots so that there is some humanity in there that hasn't been driven out by the corporate membrane. So we aim to create a body of data. Some of it will be necessarily open, some of it cannot be, and it will be licensed, and people will need to pay for it. They need to know the value in order to pay for it, and that is part of our challenge, is to make saving the planet profitable. Because if we can crack that one, then I think our job is halfway done. And as technologists, we seek to do so with data. In my view, when we start to bring in AI, we are using very basic AI just to connect the dots on records and to identify entities and to extract information that's useful from compliance documents. But it's still only very basic, and we still rely very heavily on the human being, which is not a bad thing at the moment, because we're not dealing with big data. We're not like terabytes and terabytes, although it will get that way. We are dealing with the 80-20 rule. And for me, it is, if 80% of the damage on the planet is being caused by 20% of the players, why not get to those 20% and help them realize what's happening and take some action? And in the UK perspective, that's 0.004% of all companies in the UK that we'd be targeting. So it doesn't sound as bad when you put it in that way. So once we've got the data connected up, we then connect the entities. That's corporate landowners, asset holders, even policymakers. And in fact, they're critical here because we aim as a data platform to ensure that the data we put together is influencing and helping to evolve policy faster. Because policy, especially when you get to having to regulate and dictate by law, that's a very blunt instrument. But we can help to make it sharper with the data that we're aggregating. There's a huge drive also by government to increase what they're calling investors in natural capital. And I guess it's to try and make sure that entities that are not government or where the taxpayer is involved, that we try and make sure that it's not the taxpayer that pays for these sorts of improvements or fixings of the planet and the environment that we have ourselves destroyed. And it's a complex landscape, but it's not one that can't be navigated. And the infrastructure that we're creating, we hope, will start to enable AI and machine learning to be able to travel much faster and create more accurate insight. But in the meantime, it's still humans. It's still humans that's doing the majority of the heavy lifting. So I have to keep working in the metaphors, but it is about a mycelium network because the data is just one thing, it's just one layer. We need to connect up the scientists, the activists. We have bots that go out and aggregate data and pull out what it thinks is meaningful, and then we have to bring it back to the scientists and the analysts so that we can make sense of it all. We can layer in supply chains now. We can start to see things by scope. So you may be aware with scope 1, it's all of your emissions by your own organization, and scope 2 is by usually your energy providers, your utility providers, your suppliers, and scope 3 is your broader supply chain upstream and downstream. But we can now enable companies to see what proportion of their tier 1s own land that is useful, because they can use their leverage to have those conversations. I've just come from a talk which was based on companies, majority of companies don't own their own property, and so how do they take action on climate? And for me, it starts with, okay, who owns that asset? They're supposed to have an EPC and an energy performance certificate. We can start with a compliance conversation and then work our way up. And yeah, if we get it right for the UK, and the UK it's a very fertile data landscape in terms of the available open data and what we're able to see in terms of relationships between entities. If we get it right for the UK, we could create the business case for creating that kind of infrastructure across the world. There are quick wins to be had if we can get that right. There has to be political will, but I would say that politicians, if you present the data properly in an easy to understand way, and so that they can see the impact, they're probably more likely to listen, provided the electorate care to. And of course, we're a network, so we need human beings. AI technologies aren't going to be planting those trees or nurturing them. I mean, you could have seeds distributed by drone, and I know that we can do that, but you still need human caring hands and people within organizations so that they can make use of that data and put assets and cash towards solving the problem. So that's kind of what we're doing with Vana. It is an experiment. It remains an experiment, because if we crack it and organizations start to behave differently because of what we make available and how we make it transparent, then yeah, that's what gets me excited, and that's what keeps me up at night, and that's what we're doing. And we're not doing it alone. We have a lovely team. So in fact, there was a point where our steering board was bigger than our team, but we now have a load of bots that go out and do stuff. We abuse them shamelessly. They go out working night and day. They don't stop, because there are a lot of companies, a lot of websites, a lot of scraping to do, and a lot of analysis to do. So as a result, we may be small, but our reach is large. There you go. That's us. And I'll stop sharing. Right.
So much, Jaya. That is a really thorough overview, I think, of the work that Vana has been doing. And I was struck there by the, the complementary access that both you and Jennifer are working around, that focuses on regulation and transformation, which was point 5 of what Jennifer's work was doing on smart forests. And I guess picking up on that particular point, before I pass on to Squirrel Nation for their response, I would just like to kind of pose a few questions and take a few questions also from the floor. So I'm aware of the set that we have standing there. So Jaya, you spoke about the levers of influence, which I thought was a handy turn of phrase here that connected these points around regulation between the two talks, and the need for a human caring hand, which is often missing from that particular equation. I was just wondering if you could, when we speak to forest dwellers that Jennifer mentioned actually many times within your talk, and perhaps Jennifer, first of all, it would be good to unpack a little bit what you mean by a forest dweller, because I can think of a multiple number, and I'm sure you are as well. But first of all, how do you define a forest dweller?
Yes, thanks. So I don't tend to work through definitional practices of making a box and then trying to put everything into it. I think forest dwellers use purposefully to not be able to settle on to one type of subject or entity. Forest dweller could be human, could be more than human, could be someone living in a community that is subsistence or semi-subsistence. It could be someone living, you know, somewhere in the UK who harvests material from forests or has some other relationship, is engaged in agroforestry. So I think the point with that is to be as broad and also potentially kind of as accommodating as possible, so that potentially also other forms of forest dwelling that are yet to come can be part of this category. That is not trying to close down, but rather open up the possibilities for forest relations. But so hopefully that answers your question. I think, you know, the need for human caring hands, I would always ask, is that, what sort of human is that? You know, I think that's maybe something we can get to later in relation to planetary praxis. Because of course, this is a space of considerable kind of growth and development in terms of people being charged with looking after forests as potentially carbon stores and so on. So I think part of that then is having to look, of course, at the labor practices that are organized to look after forests, to plant forests. These are all things that I guess are exactly why I would say that social scientists and people in the arts and humanities are really key in these conversations, that restoration involves, you know, as Jaya said, all of the actors. So it's really about then thinking further about all of those actors.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Jaya, you spoke a lot about that intersection between open and closed data as one of those leverages, in a sense. Could you speak a little bit more to that? And perhaps, Jennifer, if there is an intersect there to your work, particularly across the 5 points, it would be interesting to know where that points around open data and how it plays into your work.
All right, so the reason why I've grasped onto open data is because I think transparency is a foundation upon which we can get meaningful change. So in the corporate sphere, you're supposed to report on various different regulations, be it modern slavery or your accounts, whatever, within 6 to 12 months of year end. And that is just too late. It is too late to do anything meaningful if the event has already happened. So I think that in the world, in the corporate world, in the financial world, we kind of need to do more to report within a meaningful time frame where actions can happen. So we're not at the moment aiming for, you know, instant live data reporting from companies, but I am thinking within 30 days, within a quarter, enables us to do that. And also broadly, there's a big battle going on that I can see in terms of, you know, the alt fact, the partial fact thing that we base policy on. We're not seeing everything that we need in order to make those good decisions. We know that good policy is dependent on good data, and we know that bad data can destroy lives when it comes to policy. We've seen it happen time and time again. So if there is a battlefront, then it is about transparency and making sure it's fully transparent, or making obvious what isn't transparent. So that brings me to closed data. So I suppose you have 3 different kinds of data. There's open, there's shared, and then there's silo data that you're never going to get access to directly. It's commercially sensitive. People are very paranoid. If you're in the defense sector, then you really don't want people to know who you're buying from in case it causes some massive national security issues. So there are reasons why some data will never be open, but it can be connected up to an infrastructure that is open. because it is the connectedness of that data that enables that quality of data to improve. The better the data, as I said, the better the output and the better the policy that comes out. So that's kind of where we're at. And land registry data is a commercial data set. It requires money to keep it up to date. So we do have to, bear in mind, are we expecting the public to pay for that? Or are we expecting those who own the land, own the asset, to be able to pay for that? So that there's an innovation to be had, to be done on licensing, I think, as well. Our prototype is very interesting. We have we're a mishmash of open, closed, commercial, and has strings attached. How we move that out into a commercial or even a non-commercial model is going to take a decent lawyer.
Jennifer, thank you.
Yes, I think this question of data is very interesting. And we are, of course, working with lots of different data sets. We're putting together a Smart Forest Atlas that is looking at participant data, environmental data, our own research data, and how to bring that together into a kind of online living repository that can be a record of our research, but also a real research tool. And so I'd be, really delighted to talk to Jaya about the data that you're using and producing to see if we can link up somehow. I think one of the areas that we are working on, and this connects to some of my longstanding interests from citizens sensing air pollution, is citizen data. And I hinted at that in my talk. So it's, thinking about data in pluralities. I would say this is another category that could be added to the open and the closed, which is, as I mentioned earlier, whose data counts? How is it possible to ensure that there's a plurality of data? It's very interesting to look at the data sets that Jaya is looking at, but also to think about what's not in a database. Perhaps the landowners, the various residents in the locations where opportunities for restoration have been identified. Those people might not have various data in databases, but they would have a lot to say about what happens in those sites of restoration. And there would be a whole number of different spokespeople who might have contributions to make to what this restoration looks like, what it involves, what sustaining it requires, and who makes decisions about what happens if alterations are made to those spaces. So there's so many aspects of social life that this throws up for questions. So the data is more than open or closed, and really requires these pluralistic engagements. And I think, transparency is an interesting but tricky category or qualifier of data, because there also are some instances where communities might be able to undertake certain actions because they're sharing data among themselves. For instance, indigenous communities, seed collectors who know where native seed supply is that they can then harvest for restoration opportunities and restoration seed supply for other places. But of course, that's not data they would necessarily want to share, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of making forest spaces observable and visible can also lead to their extraction. So I think there are orders of data that could be added to this that start to shapeshift the open and the closed. Of course, we're required to have our data open, but we're always thinking about this as something that is more than just a universality of data, but really is about plurality.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I think that's a really useful point here to pass over to our respondents, actually, Squirrel Nation, in relation to those questions that I think plurality intersects, and so to speak, with intersectional praxis as well. There's some points that also have come up that we can return to in the discussion, as we have plenty of time, and please, those that are on the floor, I have not forgotten you either. Squirrel Nation, could you please introduce your work? I know that there is much resonance here to the speakers, and also introduce yourselves and your response. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for inviting us. So I'm Erinma, this is Caroline. We're a duo who combine transdisciplinary research through design studio practice. My background in neuroscience and Caroline's background is in art and design. So our focus is on coexistence as an ethic. Previously, we've designed an urban mushroom farm, so kind of rethinking local circular economy, and also looking at working with environmental scientists around plant choices for what food we might grow in 2050 with climate crisis. So currently we're one of 4 fellowships with Just AI and Ada Lovelace Institute, who are focused on AI and racial justice. So to respond, thank you very much to the organisers for inviting us to respond. And we're really delighted to add to the conversation that Jennifer and Jaya have opened up. Hopefully our response can build on and open up what has been said and to consider more of a racial justice perspective. So on our Just AI Fellowship, which is focused on racial justice, we've been grappling a lot with how the field of and thinking behind AI tends to be dominated and controlled by the main forces of power. The money leads the becoming of the technology. As a consequence, AI doesn't get imagined for or deployed for societal needs. And even when it does, it can inadvertently, as well as intentionally, be used for exploitation and capitalist gain. And also further destruction of the planet. So we're wondering, how do we ever get to see the other side of what might be possible when AI is imagined in the way that it currently is?
Yeah, one of our long-running concerns is absolutely, forestation, afforestation, and also the algorithmic gaze, which opens up spaces to be quantified, captured, and exploited. Obviously, as we've already seen, drones play a big part in this as well. And there's this this kind of dichotomy, where they're used now for surveying, and so rather than imagery, they're used for data capture to prospect new sites for development. But as well, the counter to that is they're also being used by indigenous populations to as a way to manage and protect forest sites. Okay. So I think one of the questions we're really kind of grappling with here is, rather than use technology against technology, go back to the idea of the right around opacity as well. And I suppose how does the planet or non-humans, I hate to just say non-human life as such, but it's also the non-life aspects of the planet, which is very important too. How does that have the right to in a way not be seen and remain slightly opaque? And so the datafication keeps driving us further and further into understanding human knowledge, but it doesn't really seem to benefit much else. So it's really kind of a way to cannibalize the earth. Okay.
Yeah, so instead, how might artificial intelligence and the technologies related to it be considered as a protective force? What if we tapped into a desire, a deep desire, an eroticism, if you like, after Audre Lorde, to imagine the world after us? How might this change our choices? In relation to AI, how might it be used to limit us as humans, to create a boundary or buffer so we don't overstep? And in that restriction, as we've seen with the pandemic, interacting with us, restricting us into lockdowns with our government's help, what might we learn from other forms of interspecies solidarity?
Maybe it's us that needs to be monitored rather than the rest of the planet.
Yeah, we actually had a piece called Unequal Presence that was part of Caroline's Masters in Research, which looked at that. But yeah, so just to counter this a little bit and to think about people's relationships with forests, to think about the culture of it. One of the things that might be considered, so Dorcetta Taylor, who's a researcher looking at the greening of Detroit and wondering why citizens there were pushing back on the planting of trees that were being planted for free and offered for free. We have to think about that pushback and the arrogance of white environmentalists who are introducing green initiatives to Black and brown communities, even if those Black and brown communities need those trees to shelter them more than ever. Not being included in the planning processes, but also the environmentalists not understanding the historical context, where, for example, in Detroit, there's a history of trees being taken down so that the residents, the Black residents, could be better monitored by the police. So those kinds of moments, you know, these echo mons that Glissant might encourage us to think about are things that we're considering in thinking about racial justice as environmental justice.
Yeah, what we just in our research, I mean, this is quite a known stat. I think that the UK only has something like 30% coverage, forest coverage, and that's in comparison to the EU, which is 35%, and maybe Japan is an interesting country to compare the UK with, and that has something like 60% coverage. So the UK Forestry Commission indicates the overall decline in tree planting since 1976 happened, and sorry, basically, what shall I say? Okay, the idea of protection basically, in a way, came from looking at the history of forest coverage in the UK, and that decline started when land cultivation came into play in the UK and farming, and is amplified through forest law introduced by William Conqueror. And so there was this kind of protection around forests, when forest wasn't, as a term, didn't actually mean forests as it does today, but it meant kind of a preserve for hunting grounds for kings. And this was kind of go on.
Yeah, so linking that back to Detroit, you know, we're looking back to the history and the culture of forests in the UK. This colonial expansion of the population under Queen Elizabeth I, the increase of timber use for fuel, shipbuilding and national security, expanding Britain's empire, essentially. And so there's pivotal books on this, you know, Silver, The Discourse of the Forest and the Trees, and the Propagation of Timber in His Majesty's Dominion. So the land architect John Evelyn talks about this and was a founder member of the Royal Society. So this advocating for reforestation and foundation of forests and parks that's been picked up by the Forestry Commission and reporting back to government we have this long history around trees in England, but actually what's the challenge around the culture there that we could think about this slightly differently, and then we'll link this back to AI. So we did want to, obviously, the health benefits that come with forests. I'm a neuroscientist by background, but in terms of our own academic links to this, people like Johnny Goldin, who asserts that friendship and its entanglement is embodied exchange between species. How can we extend this to non-humans and having a planetary consciousness, as Jennifer's been talking about with us? Solidarity with Bolivia, who have the laws of Mother Earth, where nature has equal rights as humans, and the Earth is defined as a unique, indivisible, self-regulating community of beings. And that's kind of where our thinking lies at the moment. We hope that we've opened up further thinking in this space, but also to say, relating back to our fellowship, we've been thinking through Sylvia Winter's work and considering the narrative and social production of ideas and what it is to be human, with human as a verb, not as a noun, where knowledge is not a subject to be studied or a set of facts, data or text, but how it frames and structures life, produces a status of human, not quite human and non-human. So we're experimenting with different ways of becoming human together, and also to end by saying environmental justice is racial justice. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Squirrel Nation, and thank you for bringing the sacredness of the earth into the closing points of your conversation and your response there, and the, I guess you could say, the ways in which people in Bolivia think through that, and also the points around protection, which made me think about, if we were to speak in the forest's name, and if the forest could speak back to us, what would it ask? And perhaps that might be something that, yeah, we could have a little think about. I don't know how people feel about answering that, in a sense, or where your line along that thought track might lead. Perhaps, Squirrel Nation, you could continue with that point.
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps I could speak mainly about my own relationships to trees, which is perhaps an unusual one, in that growing up in the East End of London, it was not something I really considered. It was only when I went on holiday in Denmark. My mum's from Denmark, single mum, she had to send us somewhere to spend our time while she worked, and we'd go to family and live on a farm. And so my relationship to trees was changed when I was surrounded by them and wasn't so fearful of them. But of course, in thinking about the social production of ideas, one of the challenges for me is, and I still don't understand this fully, and it needs to be explored in more detail, many of the ideas around the relationship to trees for me had come through people like Billie Holiday, singing the song of lynching in America. And so my experiences of race and racism in this country and walking through forests would be linked to that, and it would plant this fear in me. But fortunately, I had this other experience of trees where I don't want to labor it too much, but this relationship, this coexistence, where it's a friendly presence. And so that violence of the lynching with trees, on poplar trees, which I still to this day don't understand, and this is something that deeply we need to understand about whiteness and white privilege, is that power and that violence that comes with that. And the counterpoint of that is, of course, how do we in this country, particularly Black British people, rebuild our relationship with trees when we don't have them as much in our surrounding neighbourhoods? I think, Caroline, you might have something that speaks to that.
I'm not sure I could really, I kind of consider the idea of the forest as something that can speak as such, but I do think we need to listen, because the forest is also, a kind of a term for multiple forms of life as well. There's no one forest or no one voice there at all. It's a cacophony, isn't it? So just a second on Erinma, the idea of friendship as well, and friendship as a way of life, and whether friendship itself could be a technology. So can we have a friendship with, supposedly non-human kind of infrastructures and sites, in a way that how do we make the space for other forms of life? Basically, that's what we're trying to kind of argue for as a way of protection and kind of limit of human activity.
And Adrienne Rich, if we just were to turn to a piece of her poetry, because you still listen, because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees.
Thank you. I think that point about listening is a very powerful one. And also, I guess, to pick up on that point about, again, the protective force and the unseen, and those who do not want to be seen, maybe those forest dwellers who may not want to make their presence visible. It makes me think a bit also of Anna Singh's work, where the multiple peoples who she was commenting on that also were in some ways not registering on those dominant forms of capital, so to speak. And I'm thinking there that forests are often sources of solitude and hideaway, and explicitly part of our imagination in terms of protecting us in ways through which we cannot be seen, and we do not want to be shown up, in a sense. I think this actually kind of links to one of the questions from the floor, from Oshnish, I hope I have pronounced your name correctly there. There are many AI for good projects involving forest mapping, detecting wildfires, etc. Is there any evidence that these projects disadvantage particular groups, such as Indigenous communities? I think that intersects with what we're speaking to, and perhaps, Jennifer, maybe you could pick that up in terms of knowledges that you may have in terms of the observation tools which you were speaking to, which of course can work in the inverse, and whether there's any examples that you can think of offhand.
Yes, so I mean, I guess here it really depends on what you mean by AI. I think, you know, I would resist the kind of tendency to see AI as this, you know, alien presence that's beaming down, you know, various kinds of forces for good or bad. Of course, AI is bundled into all kinds of technological, social, political infrastructures. But yes, I mean, there have been many examples of how projects that have the best intentions, of course, end up having all kinds of unintended consequences, or can disadvantage many different groups, not just Indigenous communities. So, you know, I think Squirrel Nation gave an excellent example of environmental initiatives full stop that can create effects that are really quite pernicious when communities are not consulted. Well, those same problematics map onto any tech for good or AI for good projects that would not engage with the people who would be infected or involved by these projects. So within our research group, there is a researcher, Trishant Simlai, who is completing his PhD and looking at the different apps, specific apps that are, and technologies that are being used by forest rangers in India, and the effects that this is having. And it's really quite a wide range of different effects, from camera traps, capturing community members who might be in forest doing all manner of activities, and they're effectively now under surveillance by virtue of trying to use camera traps to monitor for biodiversity, for instance. Forest rangers are having to become more sort of militarized in their activities and less oriented toward forest protection as such, because many of their activities are turned into enforcement activities by virtue of an app they use. And then their relationship to fellow community members can be one of criminalizing them rather than, you know, other kinds of relationships you might have. I mean, there are really countless examples such as these that have particular kinds of social political effects because decisions are taken along farther up the tech chain. As you know, as we heard from Squirrel Nation, power leads the becoming of technology most often. I really like that phrase. So here, you know, I think we should always be asking, with these initiatives, even if they are for good initiatives, how is the problem configured? Who's involved? What are the effects? How are these practices sustained? Who's consulted? Who actually has power as part of these configurations? I think this is all part of what needs to be considered in how to arrive at these other possibilities for tech, so that it isn't simply implementing a kind of you know, kind of ideal scenario for how to save the world, as it were, but is really starting from the conditions and the groups of people, in my case, as I'm talking about the forest dwellers, who are affected by these decisions, and that could also help to redesign these technologies, maybe even make them less sort of resource intensive. I think I saw a question about this in the Q&A as well, and this is something we're definitely considering. It's a cross-cutting concern. You know, also a question from Squirrel Nation: is datafication a way to cannibalize the earth? I think this is something that really needs to be considered, so that this isn't just bolting on more and more tech as a way to, you know, kind of compute our way out of the problem in some kind of Leibnizian fantasy, but really thinking in a quite, you know, kind of measured and detailed and democratic and equitable way, a pluralistic way, about how to do technology otherwise.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Jaya, I'd like to also just pick up actually in terms of that participatory process, in a sense, and involving the community. So if your community are the corporates, the corporate practices that you want to change and transform, and some of the regulatory sort of practices, how beyond revealing the data to them are you working with them? Is there a process of sort of workshopping, for example, or speaking, or could you speak a little bit towards that aspect of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So it actually started with thinking about community groups who were forming. I was under the impression that they would be affiliating with, organizations like Woodland Trust and Friends of the Earth and others, and they would, sort of gather around those entities. But as it turns out, these groups are very informal. They have far-reaching connections, but they exist around a place. So it might be around a village, a parish council, or a group that is based around a school network. So what we aim to aggregate what we can see. And we've called this part of the project the Land Army, a different kind of land army, the one that we will need to actually deliver what we're saying in terms of afforestation and nature restoration. So yeah, we're trying to find a way of enabling these groups to define themselves, because it could be a single entity, it could be one person who says, I want to get my hands dirty and dig a hole in this area here, and that could be one form of individual activism, or they may wish to connect up with groups that are in existence. And then of course we aim to connect up corporates that have land but may not have the resource or the profit margin or the headspace to be able to do something with that land. But if we connect them up with those groups, they can have those conversations and we can track them. So critically, again, whether or not they come to an arrangement where trees get in the ground, or we fix or we repair that land in another way, if it's peat or another kind of land that needs that kind of treatment, we monitor what happens either way. And we can bring in extra data. We can look at it from the sky and say, look, from satellite imagery, we can see X, Y, and Z about the land. We can stick in a couple of drones and say, well, this is what's going on there. But actually, we want to human check everything at this point because of what's been raised already, that we can datafy ourselves into a heat death, or we could use technology for what it's good for and enable it to connect up people who are the custodians of the planet, the ones that actually have an interest in having a breathable atmosphere and water they can drink and land that isn't submerged in water so that they can live on it. We have those drivers, and we just need to use the technology for the connection bit, the communication bit, where face-to-face doesn't work. So yeah, we are totally about growing community. We are not just an online platform. We can't be, but we can report back and hold others accountable by what we report back online. So this was never supposed to be a technology first approach. We seek to humanize corporates, and there's a thick membrane to get through, and what we're trying to do is provide the right data to reach through that membrane into the people that A, give a damn, and B, are empowered to do something or could be.
Thank you, Jaya. Squirrel Nation, did you want to say something there? I just felt a movement on the screen. No, you're comfortable.
That's so funny. We just put some links in the chat to share connections around open data and growers. And then we've documented some people doing that in the States, linked to people doing that in Manchester, which might be of interest to Jaya. And then the urban farming project that we mentioned.
Thank you very much. Just taking another quick question from the floor, that's to you, Jennifer, regarding the environmental impact of the technologies that you're using, the CO2 footprint essentially. Are you calculating that within the project, or is that part of the work that you're doing? This is from a question from anonymous attendee.
Oh, I wish I could be an anonymous attendee. That must be the most desirable state on a Zoom call.
It could be any of us, Jennifer. Any of us could be anonymous.
I mean, yes, absolutely. This is a long-running thread within my work. even before smart forests, I've done extensive work on electronic waste and data centers and electrical grids, energy use. Of course, I'd like to do much more on this, but there's only so many hours in the day. And as I mentioned, we are certainly attending to this as part of our work on smart forests. Whether we're going to the level of calculating, I'll leave that potentially to the computer scientists to calculate all the possible ways in which this infrastructure is leading to CO2. But we certainly will be attending to the resources required to sustain something like a kind of smart forest initiative. I think these are essential questions that need to be asked, that digital technology doesn't get a free pass, as though it doesn't require all of the minerals that are extracted to make these devices run, all of the manufacturing and labor that goes into designing and developing them and building them. Of course, you know, when I was working on electronic waste, the highest number of Superfund sites were in Silicon Valley in the US. So these are highly hazardous sites that were contaminated from wafer manufacture, which of course is now taking place in Taiwan and other places, with the footnote that there's of course a chip shortage. So we'll see how that also might remake the landscape of chip production, as well as the pollution that comes with it. Of course, electronics become highly obsolete and are disposed of in all sorts of locations, properly or improperly, are burned, and all kinds of debris is left in the environment and travels to the ocean as well. And there are sites even in recycling villages in China where buried e-waste is now being extracted for the gold and other minerals in tiny amounts that's in this debris. So data centers, AI model training, this is just adding to the really, well, dirty data is a phrase we heard, and I couldn't help but think of the other side of the dirty as not just that it needs to be cleaned, but that it is deeply material, resource intensive, polluting, and really completely, it seems, a free-for-all in the space of AI. We've seen this with cryptocurrency, with NFTs, that really just kind of whatever people want to do without any sort of thought for the repercussions for the planet. So I think with any smart forest initiative, this kind of contradiction where digital technologies, these infrastructures would be implemented in order to monitor, manage, and transform the planet, ideally to address environmental change, what are the impacts of these technologies that would be put in place to do this? I think this is why the phrase, you know, datafication as a way to cannibalize the earth is a very good one, because this kind of tension, I've tried to pull out as well by looking at how you know, you can monitor the environment, but that very process of monitoring is contributing to the problem that it would measure. And this seems to become a kind of entropic loop, as it were. You know, it's that problem of, can you cool a room if you leave the refrigerator door open? The answer is no. So, you know, I think we need to ask this with AI.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I guess also that brings maybe to perhaps a final question in a way, in that, do you all of, and I ask this to all of you, do you see the possibility of your efforts as a potential decentering of the human in this entanglement that we've had, where we've been privileging ourselves first and foremost above all other species? And where, and if you do see your efforts in that vein as a decentering, could you expand a little bit on that? And perhaps also then a second part of this is to look towards what are those connections between sort of the big scale measurements and the planetary kind of practices, the different points, in a sense, which I feel you're all coming in to this conversation along a spectrum, and where are the efforts that you sort of see most needed when you listen to each other, perhaps seeing that the other is fulfilling a little part of that jigsaw, but what would most benefit your own individual practices or collective practices, mainly in that context. So I guess the first point really is to just reiterate, do you see your efforts decentering the human, centering?
I'm trying to get my head around what do you mean by decentering. For me, it is about acknowledging that human beings have many different roles, and they have all of those roles to play and to bring to address the issue. So the technology that we are bringing into play should enable a human being to be that human being that has its own agency, their own agency, but also they are an employer or an employee, they are a family member, they are multiple different types, they're consumers. So I think it's about enabling them to use the power that they have and connect up with those different identities. So, okay, that's a really techie way of saying it, I think. But I would hope that technology could be used to, rather than put everyone in the same bag and say, look, just go sort it, we humanize things more. So if, yeah, the aim is to humanize from my perspective.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Yes, well, I mean, I was really glad to hear Squirrel Nation mention that they're engaging with Sylvia Wynter's work. I also have been quite interested by her way of asking, what is it to be a human? And of course, the classic example she uses that everyone's citing now is with this phrase, human-induced climate change, that humans are responsible. Of course, this is true on one level, but on another level, it's completely problematic because certain kinds of humans cause the problem of climate change. And these are humans who have lived in the world in particular ways. And often those ways of living in the world involve domination over other entities and other races and people who are differently classed and sexed and so on. So how can this way of being human really be opened up and queried? And this is why thinking of the human as a verb rather than a noun is such an important project, because this could then involve thinking about how to become a human who is in relation with other entities without having to have that be extractive, is in relation with other humans in ways that is not extractive. And that's the very text, the Wynter text, where she talks about being human as a praxis, that informs my phrase being planetary as a praxis. I developed this in an essay called Becoming Planetary, where I think also about how the planetary is not a singular, taken for granted category. So to be planetary as praxis is to ask how the planetary could also be a verb, how this is not just a static object that is governed through often technocratic measures, but is something that is always in the process of becoming and is making demands on us to think about how to do technology and society and politics differently so that we can bring other kinds of worlds into being. So I think this is, I suppose, a decentering, but I always describe it more as a kind of project of pluralism, of trying to find ways to bring more and other worlds into being that can start to create other opportunities for how to engage in environments and also to coexist. So yes, hopefully that starts to bring together some of the points about the human.
Thank you. Thank you. Squirrel Nation, would you like to close with some final points?
Yeah, well, I suppose what we kind of drawn from Sylvia Wynter's is specifically her concept on man too. So, you know, prescribing that obviously to via the Anthropocene discourse to, you know, man-induced climate change rather than human, because we know it's not humanity necessarily that have got us to this current conjuncture.
Yeah, so picking up on people like Spivak and the planetary conjuncture, this tension between who gets to be human and who doesn't, and Sylvia Wynter kind of allows us to think across that, but also work of Patricia Hill-Collins around intersectionality. So taking Kimberly Crenshaw's work further in trying constantly, as if you're Black, if you're disabled, if you're queer, we're in planetary revolution all of the time, and we have to find a line of flight out of the grid that tries to lock us into the universal standard of the white cisgendered male, who's also heterosexual. So we're absolutely solidarity across those different perspectives, and trying to find those lines of flight outwards from the grid. And just to give a simple example of how that allows us to imagine beyond racial capitalism, just from our looking at the lawns that are growing and having different choices. What if we decide not to cut the lawn? The lawns everywhere in Cambridge, in our backyards, all over the world. What happens when the bees come?
And just to finish off from our side, I think we're very interested in post-humanism and thinking through that as a practice. So moving beyond, or trying to critique, I suppose, humanism itself is perhaps a little bit of a problem. Obviously, it's not perfect in itself. There's all sorts of issues, but I think it does offer a different way of framing thinking. Yeah,
and just final thing would be to say, one of those things is to put in place refusal around some of these technologies. And if you want to hear more about that, come and meet our colleagues on Thursday. The other racial justice fellows we're having more conversations about that.
Thank you so much, Squirrel Nation, for flagging the upcoming session. I think that's very generous and also relevant conversation, as you say, to extend what we have here. I love that, again, that line of flight from the grid. I think that's a very poetic way to end a session, which I've been very touched by in terms of all of your practices relating to forests and trees and the complexities that you have shed light on in terms of how data and AI and the role of the tech that we are developing, and both enhances, negates, problematizes, and perhaps helps us out of some of the trouble that we are in. And I would like to thank you all and wish success in all your endeavors. And we're coming to the close. And so I'd also like to thank Ada Lovelace, Alison Powell, Louise Hickman, and all of the colleagues that have put this together. There is any points here, perhaps, Alison, that you might want to pop back in terms of closing thank yous or also next steps?
I would just like to say thank you to everyone, and also please attend, as Squirrel Nation has reminded us, the panel on Thursday, which will be highlighting their work as part of the fellowship that they've completed at Just AI, along with their colleagues who have also been working on racial justice issues. So Thursday at our same 1 p.m. time. Tomorrow there's a discussion of rights, access, and refusal. And on Friday, there's a discussion of ethics in practice in technology companies. So please join us for those if you're interested. Thank you so much, Teresa and colleagues, for an amazing session. I really learned a lot.
Thank you.
Pleasure.